Hey guys, tonight we wander into a smoky Viking mead hall where the fire crackles, the benches creak, and something deeply questionable simmers in a cauldron. You can practically smell the roasted meat, the spilled ale, and well, that faint tang of something you probably won't survive if you actually put it in your mouth. That's right. We're diving into the bizarre, sometimes horrifying, but strangely fascinating world of Viking food. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and your local time down in the comments. I always love seeing where and when you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You sit among Viking warriors, their voices rumbling in Old Norse as they slam wooden cups against the tables. The air is thick with smoke from the hearth fire, carrying both the savory scent of roasting meat and the unmistakable tang of fermenting fish. A platter arrives, boiled sheep's head, eyes intact, steam curling upward like a dare. You watch as one warrior digs in with gusto, cracking bones for marrow, while another tears into dried fish, teeth straining. This is no modern buffet. Here, food is survival, and sometimes survival tastes like desperation. Vikings lived in a land where winters bit hard and summers were too short to grow much. They needed calories, fats, proteins, and anything remotely edible. That meant their definition of food stretched much farther than yours. They ate what was available, and often what was just barely edible. Historical fact: archaeologists confirm that in Viking settlements, mead halls weren't just party places. They were central hubs for politics, community, and trade deals. Imagine sealing a major alliance while chewing something that smelled like the underside of a ship. Quirky detail: the bread often had bits of ground stone in it because Viking flour mills weren't exactly delicate. Eating a slice meant slowly sanding down your teeth. Dentists would have had a field day if Vikings had dentists. And scholars still argue whether Viking feasts were truly lavish for the common folk, or whether most of the grandeur we imagine comes from sagas that exaggerated the scale. Were you sitting in a crowded smoky hut, or in a grand feasting hall with boar roasted on a spit? The truth is likely both, depending on who you were and how much loot you'd brought home. You sip from a wooden horn, honey-sweet mead coating your tongue. Around you, laughter grows louder, songs echo against the rafters, and plates are filled with things you'd hesitate to poke with a fork today. This is the first bite of Viking cuisine. Bold, strange, and often testing the limits of your stomach. You wander outside the smoky mead hall, stepping into the salty air of a Viking harbor. The gulls circle overhead, crying as fishermen haul nets from their longships. The catch of the day isn't destined for fresh frying. It's going to be dried, salted, or, in some unfortunate cases, buried until it's more rot than fish. Welcome to the world of Viking seafood, where fermentation is not just an option, it's a survival strategy. You lean closer to a wooden rack where split fish are hanging, drying stiff in the cold breeze. This is stockfish, dried cod, tough as wood, but a Viking staple that could last for months or even years. Imagine chewing on something with the texture of a roof shingle, and you've got the right idea. But it worked. It fed sailors on long voyages, gave warriors protein on raids, and ensured that winters weren't totally unbearable. Historical fact: Norway became a hub for exporting dried cod during the Viking Age, and that tradition still exists today. In fact, stockfish is still traded internationally. It's basically a 1,000-year-old Viking business plan that never went out of style. Quirky detail: fermented fish wasn't just food, it was a smell bomb. A version called rakfisk involved trout salted and left to ferment in barrels for weeks. You unwrap it, and suddenly your house smells like a combination of sweaty socks and low tide. You probably wouldn't survive the stench alone, let alone the taste. Scholars still argue whether Vikings truly enjoyed the flavor of these fermented fish, or whether it was just eat this or starve. Some claim that sagas hint at pride in serving strong-flavored foods, while others think Vikings were simply toughing it out with pinched noses. You follow the fishermen further down the shore, where they're burying barrels in cool sand, letting nature do the preservation. Another group smears fish with salt, stacking them like logs for winter storage. The entire scene is practical, but you feel your stomach turn as you imagine sitting down to a meal of half-spoiled fish. And yet, picture the alternative: snow piling high outside, no crops, no game in the forest, no imports from trade routes. That bite of rank fish might just be the difference between seeing spring again or not. The Vikings understood something deeply primal. You eat what keeps you alive, not what makes your Instagram feed pretty. A warrior rips into a piece of dried cod, gnawing like it's leather. Another dips strips into butter or broth to soften the bite. You can almost hear your jaw ache at the thought. Tonight, fish is survival, and survival doesn't care about flavor. You wander deeper into the settlement, past smoke drifting from turf-roofed houses, and catch the heavy, iron-rich smell of meat. It's not the kind of meat you'd find neatly wrapped in a grocery store. It's rough cuts, hacked with axes, sizzling over open fires. And yes, you'll notice right away, the Vikings didn't waste a single part of an animal. You pause near a butcher's block where a freshly slaughtered sheep is being worked on. The obvious cuts, the legs, the ribs, those are prized, sure, but what happens next is more telling. A farmer carefully scrapes brains from the skull, not to toss, but to whip into a strange porridge-like mash. In the Viking world, brains could be food, tanning material for hides, or both. Imagine eating something that doubles as leather treatment. Suddenly, your appetite falters. Historical fact: archaeological digs in Viking Age sites show butchered bones with cut marks that reveal just how thoroughly every part of an animal was used. Meat was valuable, yes, but marrow, organ meats, even hooves all had a place. Quirky detail: some sagas describe feasts where sheep's heads were boiled and served whole. Guests would pick at cheeks, eyes, tongues, basically a medieval version of nose-to-tail dining. And yes, eye soup was absolutely a thing. You can't help but picture yourself politely declining while everyone else digs in. Scholars still argue whether these gross bits were seen as delicacies or simply tolerated necessities. Some argue that elites enjoyed brains and offal as treats, while others believe the rich preferred cleaner cuts and left the weird stuff for peasants. Either way, nobody wasted anything. Nearby, a pot simmers with blood sausage, animal blood mixed with fat, oats, and spices stuffed into intestines. You watch a child happily gnawing on a slice, and suddenly you realize what sounds like nightmare fuel today was comfort food for them. Blood was just another ingredient, not a taboo. You step into a hall where a feast is underway. Warriors tear into roasted lamb ribs, grease dripping down beards, while others slurp broth made from boiled bones. Someone cracks a marrow bone with an iron hammer and sucks the inside like it's candy. The room fills with laughter, the crackle of fire, and the unshakable reminder: every ounce of this animal has been put to use. Then comes the oddest sight. You glimpse a woman preparing sheep stomach, stuffed with barley, onions, and herbs. It's hearty, filling, and surprisingly, not awful. You think of it as an ancient cousin of haggis, a recipe that still sparks strong opinions centuries later. Your stomach twists between revulsion and awe. You realize survival isn't about pretty plates. It's about squeezing every calorie out of the world around you. In the Viking Age, the motto might as well have been, eat what's in front of you or die hungry. You step away from the meat-heavy feast hall and drift toward the softer smells of hearth smoke and baking. Outside one of the turf-roofed houses, a woman kneels by a flat stone, grinding grain into coarse flour with slow, steady motions. The gritty sound fills the air, like sand being scrubbed. You realize quickly that for all the meat you just witnessed, most Vikings didn't eat ribs every day. Grain was the backbone of their diet. You peek inside the dim interior. On a clay hearth sits a round flatbread, charred at the edges, steam rising as it's pulled off the hot stones. It smells earthy, almost nutty. Viking bread wasn't fluffy or refined. It was dense, chewy, sometimes gritty enough to wear down your teeth. Archaeologists have literally found Viking skeletons with sand-worn molars from bread made with poorly ground flour. That's right, you wouldn't just eat the bread, you'd slowly grind your teeth away with it. Historical fact. Evidence from digs in Denmark and Sweden show that barley was the most common grain, followed by oats and rye. Wheat was rare, expensive, and considered a luxury. So when you picture Vikings, don't imagine soft baguettes. Think more like tough barley cakes. Quirky detail. Sometimes the dough was mixed with tree bark. Yes, bark. When grain supplies ran low, especially during harsh winters, ground-up pine bark could be baked into bread. It filled stomachs but wasn't exactly a taste explosion. If you've ever chewed on a pencil, congratulations, you've had the flavor profile. Scholars still argue whether Viking bread was leavened at all or more like hard crackers. Some experimental bakers say yeast could have been used. Others think most bread was flat and unleavened. Either way, nobody was biting into croissants. You watch a family huddle around a bubbling pot of gruel. It's oats boiled with goat's milk and maybe a sprinkle of herbs. A little sweet honey drizzled on top makes it almost pleasant, but most days it was bland. Imagine eating warm porridge 3 times a day, 7 days a week. That's not far off from the Viking peasant experience. Nearby, a group of children chew on crunchy little bread twists baked with hazelnuts, an occasional treat when nuts were gathered in season. For festivals, women added butter, honey, or berries, turning simple barley cakes into something closer to dessert. But such luxuries were rare. The daily grind, literally, was porridge and bread. You crouch by the hearth, feeling the grainy texture of a bread loaf in your hand. Heavy, hearty, and almost weapon-like. It feels less like food and more like survival, pressed into a circle. No wonder the Vikings were strong. They lived off iron-hard bread that could double as a shield. As you sit back, you realize, in a world where winter could kill, food didn't need to be delicious. It just needed to keep you alive. And for the Vikings, barley and oats were as essential as sword and shield. A salt wind hits your face as you wander down to the shore. The sea stretches endlessly, gray and restless, and suddenly it makes sense. Of course the Vikings relied heavily on the waters. The land could betray them with failed harvests, but the sea always had fish. You watch men pulling heavy nets from their longboats, muscles straining as cod, herring, and salmon flop wildly. The scene is noisy. The air thick with the briny smell of the ocean, mixed with fish scales and seaweed. This isn't just dinner, it's survival in motion. Mainstream historical fact. Herring and cod were the backbone of the Viking diet, so abundant that they became vital trade goods. Dried fish could last for months and feed crews on long voyages across the North Atlantic. Without it, the raids and explorations that made the Vikings infamous would have been impossible. A quirky detail catches your eye. Along the shoreline, some villagers are fermenting fish in pits. They bury the catch, let it rot just enough, and then dig it up again for consumption. You think you've smelled bad leftovers before, but this is next level. Some say Viking fermented fish makes modern glue cheese smell like perfume. Scholars still argue whether the infamous lutefisk of later Scandinavian cuisine traces back to Viking traditions. Was it already a thing in the 9th century, or did it develop much later? Either way, the thought of dried fish softened in lye doesn't exactly make your stomach growl. Nearby, women prepare fish for winter storage. They split cod open, spread it wide, and hang it on wooden racks to dry in the cold northern wind. The fish stiffens into something like a wooden plank, hard as stone, but if you smash it with a hammer and soak it, it becomes edible again. Imagine gnawing on jerky, but much saltier and far tougher. Children sit around the fire with skewered eels sizzling over the flames. The smell is rich, oily, almost sweet. Eel was a delicacy for those lucky enough to catch it. Elsewhere, someone roasts a massive salmon stuffed with herbs, reserved for feasts, when warriors returned from raids with stolen silver and stories. The sounds of gulls echo as you watch barrels being filled with salted herring. Salt was precious, often traded from the south, but it could turn fish into an edible time capsule. A salted herring barrel might be the difference between a crew starving at sea or reaching new shores. And then there are shellfish. You spot villagers prying open mussels and oysters with crude iron knives, slurping them down raw. The sea may be harsh, but it offers its gifts in layers. Cod for trade, herring for storage, salmon for festivals, shellfish for quick snacks. As you breathe in the salty air, you realize the ocean wasn't just a path for Viking raids. It was their pantry, their marketplace, their lifeline. Every fish pulled from the waves was a piece of their empire's foundation. Every dried cod as valuable as gold when crossing stormy seas. You step into a smoky farmhouse, ducking your head under the low wooden beams. The smell inside is a strange mixture. Smoke from the hearth, damp wool, and something sweetly sour. It doesn't take long for you to realize you've wandered straight into a Viking dairy workshop. On one side of the room, a woman stirs milk in a clay pot, her hands steady and practiced. Cows, sheep, and goats were the true engines of Viking households. Their milk wasn't just drunk fresh. It was transformed into butter, cheese, and sour concoctions that could keep for months. Without them, life in this cold northern world would have been brutal. Mainstream historical fact. Archaeological evidence shows that dairying was central to Viking subsistence. Wooden churns, cheese molds, and even residue from milk fat on pottery shards prove that dairy products were made in abundance. Butter wasn't just food, it was also used as payment in trade and even stored underground as treasure, packed in birch bark containers. You watch as a girl shakes a goatskin bag until it froths, gradually separating curds from whey. It's mesmerizing, and you can almost hear her humming softly, a tune lost to time. Butter emerges from this process like golden sunshine, thick, fatty, and utterly essential for a diet that had to fuel men who rowed long ships for hours on end. Now comes the quirky detail. Imagine yogurt, but crank up the tang and thickness. Vikings loved a fermented milk drink known as skyr, something between yogurt and cheese. Thick, slightly sour, eaten with honey or berries when available. Some historians argue that skyr was an Icelandic invention, while others insist the tradition spread across the Norse world earlier. Scholars still argue whether skyr was the same product we know today or something rougher, chunkier, and far less appetizing. Over in the corner, you notice blocks of hard, pungent cheese being cut and wrapped. It's no creamy brie. Think dense, salty wheels that could last through winter without refrigeration. Perfect for long journeys, terrible if you dislike strong flavors. Some cheeses were so aged they required soaking before eating, much like dried fish. And then there's the sweet tooth side of things. You watch children giggle as they dip chunks of sour cheese into honey, one of the rare natural sweeteners the Vikings prized. Bees were kept in woven skeps, and honey wasn't just food, it was magic. It flavored mead, healed wounds, and turned even the harshest meals into something close to a treat. A boy licks a wooden spoon coated in clotted cream, his face smeared with dairy happiness. For a moment, you forget about raids and battles. Here, in this farmhouse, it's all about survival flavored with comfort. You glance at the shelves where clay jars of sour milk are stored. The liquid is lumpy, tart, and surprisingly nutritious. Think of it as Viking kefir, bubbling with natural fermentation. The smell might turn your stomach, but to them it was daily fuel. As you leave, you can't help but grin at the thought. You came expecting warriors and axes, but here you are, learning that behind every berserker was probably a bowl of fermented milk or a chunk of hard cheese. The Vikings didn't just eat to survive. They ate with ingenuity, turning every drop of milk into a dozen different flavors. You wander beyond the farmstead, into the edge of the forest. The salty sea air fades, replaced by the earthy scent of moss and damp soil. Here, the Vikings weren't just warriors or farmers, they were foragers, combing woods and riverbanks for whatever nature offered. You spot baskets filled with berries, nuts, and herbs, the quiet treasures of a Viking diet. Mainstream historical fact: archaeological digs show that berries like bilberries, lingonberries, and cloudberries were staples in the Viking world. Seeds of these fruits have been found preserved in old cesspits and wells, tiny time capsules proving that foraging was an everyday necessity. You crouch near a bush heavy with lingonberries, their red skins glowing like rubies in the half-light. Vikings plucked these by the handful, eating them raw or boiling them into tart stews. Imagine cranberries but sharper, the perfect antidote to fatty fish or greasy mutton. Cloudberries, rare and golden, were even more prized. Their sweet sour burst like a northern sun captured in fruit form. And then come the nuts. Hazelnuts dominate your view, cracked shells scattered like confetti across a fire pit. Vikings roasted, ground, or simply cracked and ate them straight. Quirky detail: whole caches of hazelnuts have been discovered in ancient Viking storage pits, sometimes thousands in one place. It's as if a Viking squirrel went shopping and then forgot about the stockpile. You imagine a family around the fire, sharing a mixture of dried berries and nuts, something that wouldn't look out of place in a modern trail mix. Except here, there's no shiny packaging, just wooden bowls and sticky fingers. Herbs, too, make their quiet entrance. You spot bunches of dill, wild garlic, and mustard seed hanging to dry. These weren't just flavor enhancers, they were survival tools. Salt was precious, so herbs stepped in to season meat, fish, and soups. A pot of nettle stew simmers, turning dark green and earthy. You wince at the thought of eating stinging nettles, but once boiled, they become packed with iron and vitamins. Scholars still argue whether Vikings intentionally cultivated orchards or simply raided wild apple trees. What we do know is that small, tart crab apples were eaten, sometimes raw, sometimes baked, sometimes fermented into cider-like brews. They were nothing like today's shiny supermarket apples. Think small, sour, and tough to chew. A child runs past you with purple-stained lips from gorging on bilberries. His laughter is a reminder that even in harsh northern climates, there were moments of sweetness. You watch women weaving wreaths of herbs and berries, not for decoration, but for drying and storing, so that a hint of summer could survive the long, dark winters. Odd details pop up in unexpected corners. For instance, mushrooms. Were they eaten? Evidence is thin, but given the forests of Scandinavia, it's hard to imagine they weren't sampled. Some historians suggest cautious use, edible fungi here and there, but nothing compared to the berry craze. And with poisonous varieties lurking nearby, maybe it was safer to leave them alone. Your hands brush over a woven basket, its bottom lined with dried leaves. Inside, hazelnuts gleam, mixed with chunks of honeycomb. A kind of primitive snack, chewy, nutty, and buzzing with energy. You picture a Viking trader munching this mix as he hauls cargo across the Baltic, the medieval equivalent of a granola bar. You step back, realizing the richness of this hidden menu. The Vikings didn't just rely on big hunts or salty fish. They scoured their environment, squeezing calories out of tiny berries, bitter greens, and nuts cracked with stone tools. And in doing so, they created a surprising balance, a splash of sour against all that fat, a handful of sweet to soften the salt. It's not the image you expected, is it? You came for warriors, and instead, you're watching a child eat bilberries and a farmer nibble hazelnuts. Yet somehow, it makes them more human, more relatable. You move closer to the longhouse hearth, and for the first time tonight, you notice something unusual: sweetness. In a world where salted fish and bitter herbs dominate, the Vikings still managed to find small indulgences, little sparks of pleasure in their rough lives. Hey, you probably didn't expect dessert in a Viking story, but here we are. You're standing near a wooden platter smeared with something sticky and golden: honey. Mainstream historical fact: honey was the main sweetener in the Viking Age, used not only in cooking, but also for fermenting into mead, their iconic drink. Archaeological finds of bee remains and honeycomb fragments across Scandinavia prove its importance, both as food and as ritual offering. You dip your finger into the honey and taste it. Thick, floral, a little wild. Imagine the bees buzzing through meadows in summer. Their work gathered and treasured by people who rarely experienced sugar in their entire lives. A Viking child might lick honey straight from the comb, while adults mixed it into porridge or spread it onto bread. And then there are berries again, but transformed. Dried, soaked in honey, or stewed into sweet sauces. Cloudberries, lingonberries, and bilberries weren't just snacks. They became little luxuries when paired with honey. You watch a woman spooning a tart berry mash onto a flat cake, creating what looks suspiciously like the ancestor of jam. Odd, quirky detail. Vikings even chewed birch sap, which hardened into a gum-like substance. Think of it as the world's earliest chewing gum. Scholars still argue whether it was eaten for fun, for hunger relief, or just to keep teeth clean. Either way, imagine a Viking warrior chewing on birch pitch while rowing across the sea. Chewing gum with a touch of tree bark bitterness. Honey wasn't only for food. Sometimes nuts and seeds were roasted with it, creating sticky clusters that hardened into primitive candy. You picture children sucking on these lumps while their parents laughed around the fire. The treat would last longer than a handful of berries, stretching sweetness into the long winter nights. And then comes dairy. You notice bowls of skyr, the Icelandic-style yogurt that's still famous today. Slightly sour, thick, and protein-packed. It wasn't exactly dessert, but when drizzled with honey or sprinkled with dried berries, it became something close. A rare softness among the harder textures of Viking meals. Some families experimented further. You overhear talk of milk curdled and boiled down into a chewy, caramel-like paste. Rare, but possible, especially when cows were generous in summer. Was it exactly candy? Maybe not, but for someone who rarely tasted sugar, it must have felt magical. Scholars still argue whether the Vikings had access to imported luxury sweets, like dried figs or dates brought through trade. Some traces suggest they did, at least in wealthier households connected to the Silk Road routes. Imagine a jar of dates arriving in a northern port, its sticky sweetness shared like treasure. You can almost hear a Viking child giggling as he sneaks a lick of honey when no one's looking, the same way modern kids sneak cookies from the jar. For a moment, the harshness of raiding and farming fades, replaced by something simple and universal: the craving for sweetness. You sit back near the fire, your hands sticky with imagined honey, and you realize pleasure wasn't absent in Viking life. It was rare, cherished, and savored. Maybe that's what made it so powerful. You lean against the long house wall, the firelight flickering, and suddenly you notice the laughter. Deep, loud, echoing with the unmistakable energy of people who've been drinking. Welcome to Viking beverages, where water is a last resort and everything else is stronger. Mainstream historical fact: the Vikings' most iconic drink was mead, a fermented blend of honey, water, and sometimes herbs. It wasn't just alcohol, it was myth. Mead was believed to be the drink of the gods, flowing in Valhalla's halls and served in great horn cups during feasts. Imagine tilting back a horn filled with golden sweetness, your throat burning, your heart warmed. You can smell it. Sweet, pungent, a little wild. But don't picture clear, polished liquor. Viking mead could be cloudy, tangy, and uneven in strength. Some batches barely gave you a buzz. Others could knock you flat. Scholars still argue whether every Viking drank it daily, or whether it was mostly a feast day luxury. Next, ale. Thick, grainy, low-alcohol ale, brewed from barley, oats, or rye. It was so common that even children probably drank weak versions, not because they were aiming for a buzz, but because ale was safer than water. Streams could be dirty. Ale had been boiled, making it less risky. Odd, quirky detail. Archaeologists found remnants of beer brewed with bog myrtle, yarrow, and other herbs instead of hops. That means Viking ale sometimes had strange flavors: floral, medicinal, even bitter enough to make your lips pucker. Imagine taking a sip and thinking, this tastes like someone boiled a forest floor, but still drinking it because hydration matters. And then there's milk. Cow, goat, and sheep milk turned into butter, cheese, and skyr. But fresh milk, when available, was consumed as well. On summer days, children might drink buttermilk while adults poured ale into their cups. Trade brought in wine too, though rarely. Wealthy chieftains might brag about serving imported wine in silver cups, proof of status. To ordinary Vikings, it was exotic and almost mythical, like tasting the sun from a faraway land. You notice a young man struggling with a barrel, pouring out something darker. Fermented whey. Yes, even leftover dairy got turned into a drink. Sour, sharp, and not exactly refreshing, but it gave calories and avoided waste. You imagine nights by the fire, horns clinking, songs rising. A man with a red beard spills ale down his tunic and doesn't care, because the hall is roaring with stories of raids and sagas. Drinking wasn't just about thirst. It was about bonding, feasting, and forgetting how harsh life could be. Scholars still argue whether Viking feasts were frequent or rare, but evidence suggests they weren't everyday affairs. So when they happened, they were explosive. Barrels rolled out, horns filled to the brim, and drunken dancing that could end in either laughter or a brawl. For a moment, you glance down at your own cup in this imagined hall. Mead, sticky and sweet. Ale, bitter and heavy. Maybe a taste of sour milk. None of it quite like the clean beverages of today, but all of it vital to Viking life. You set the horn down, and the hall quiets slightly. Outside, snow presses against the walls, but inside, the warmth of drink and voices turns survival into celebration. You step onto the frozen shoreline, where the longship waits, its prow slicing through mist and morning light. This isn't a cozy hearth. This is Viking life on the move. And what the Vikings ate on raids or long journeys is a tale all its own. Mainstream historical fact: Vikings needed food that could endure long voyages. Dried fish, salted meats, hard bread, and cheese were staples. Archaeologists have uncovered preserved cod and herring stored in barrels, often coated with salt or smoked to last weeks. Without these provisions, rowing across the North Sea would have been impossible. You watch the crew lift barrels onto the ship, their hands red from cold and effort. Some barrels hold dried fish, almost brittle to the touch, yet packed with protein. Others carry jerky-like strips of mutton or beef, tough and chewy. You nibble a piece in your imagination. It's dense, salty, and oddly satisfying, proof that survival demands ingenuity. Quirky detail: Vikings even carried dried blood pudding on journeys. Blood mixed with grains, shaped into cakes, then dried to preserve. Strange to modern eyes, but rich in nutrients and long-lasting. Scholars still argue whether these blood cakes were a regular ration or reserved for special occasions. Bread, too, was essential. Hard, flat loaves, sometimes unleavened, baked in stone ovens or on iron griddles. They lasted weeks when stored properly and were versatile. Eaten plain, they were fuel. Dipped in soup or smeared with butter, they became a modest treat. You peer into the hold of the ship. Barrels of fermented whey or sour milk are strapped carefully, a reminder that Vikings refused to waste calories. Even on dangerous raids, every drop of nutrition counted. A handful of skyr or cheese could mean the difference between strength and fatigue after a day of rowing or fighting. Herbs and dried fruits were rare luxuries on voyages, but sometimes included. A few dried berries, tucked into cloth or small sacks, added flavor and variety. Imagine a tart burst of lingonberry amidst weeks of salty fish. It must have felt like a treasure. Oddly, Vikings occasionally preserved meat in lard. Chunks of fat sealed around fish or pork, kept in barrels, preventing spoilage. To us, it sounds greasy and strange, but for them, it was a reliable, calorie-dense survival tool. Scholars still argue whether salted provisions were preferred over dried ones, or vice versa. Some evidence suggests northern crews relied more on salted fish, while southern-bound traders leaned on dried meats. Either way, preservation dictated life at sea. You glance at a young warrior chewing on dried mutton. His hands are cold, his face streaked with salt and wind, yet there's a kind of satisfaction in each bite, a quiet triumph of human ingenuity over nature's harshness. And then you notice barrels of mead tucked away, not for immediate drinking, but for ceremonies and toasting victories. Even on raiding missions, celebration was never far. Survival and pleasure intertwined, just as they had always been for the Vikings. You wander past the longhouse into a shadowy grove, the light filtering through frost-laden branches. This is where Viking diets reveal their strangest, most daring side, the foods that would make modern palates cringe. Mainstream historical fact: archaeological evidence shows that Vikings sometimes ate animals we would consider unusual or even repulsive today, including horse, dog, and various wild birds. Some of these choices were practical, available protein sources in a harsh northern climate. You spot a woman tending a small pen, its occupants skittering and squeaking. Some are young pigs, others rabbits, and one odd creature, a dog kept for both companionship and, occasionally, the table. Scholars still argue whether dog meat was a last resort food or more commonly consumed in Viking society. Odd, quirky detail: Vikings also consumed fermented shark, a dish still eaten in parts of Scandinavia today. You imagine the pungent smell, the ammonia-heavy tang that assaults your senses. Yet for them, it was a protein-rich delicacy. You probably won't survive tasting this without gagging, but they did, routinely, even enjoying it at feasts. Off to the side, you notice jars filled with preserved birds' eggs. Some are cracked and baked into stews, others pickled in brine. Vikings were opportunistic, and nothing went to waste. A swan's egg or goose egg could be a special treat. Much larger and richer than ordinary chicken eggs. You follow the path further and discover roots and tubers dug from frost-hardened soil. Vikings prized wild onions, leeks, and sometimes even ferns. Scholars still argue whether ferns were eaten as survival food or merely experimental bites during famine. You nibble one leaf in imagination, bitter, fibrous, but full of nutrients. Quirky detail. There's also evidence that Vikings ingested pine bark, ground into a flour substitute during harsh winters. Imagine gnawing on tree bark to stave off hunger. It sounds absurd now, yet in desperate months it sustained entire communities. You crouch by a barrel containing pickled fish and see small bones you almost miss. Vikings ate every edible part. Eyes, heads, even roe were consumed, sometimes considered delicacies. Modern diners might flinch, but for Vikings, nothing edible went unused. And then there's the fermented oddity: dairy and blood concoctions mixed into stews or cakes. Sour, thick, and nutrient-dense. They aren't appetizing in the modern sense, yet they provided essential sustenance. You watch a warrior nibble on a piece of dried horse meat, savoring it in silence as the wind howls across the fjord. For him, flavor was secondary. Survival, endurance, and strength came first. Yet somehow, these unusual choices bound the community together, a shared experience of toughness and resilience. By the time you leave the grove, you realize Viking diets weren't just practical, they were fearless. They pushed boundaries, experimented boldly, and embraced the edible oddities of their environment. You step back into the longhouse, the fire roaring, and the tables groaning under piles of food. This is Viking culinary culture at its fullest: feasts, rituals, and a celebration of what they could eat, no matter how strange it seems to you. Mainstream historical fact: Viking feasts were more than meals, they were social and religious events. They celebrated seasonal changes, successful raids, and honored the gods. Archaeological evidence of large serving bowls, drinking horns, and even decorated meat hooks attests to these communal gatherings. You watch as a horn is passed from hand to hand, filled with mead that glows amber in the firelight. Each sip is a shared experience, binding warriors, families, and even travelers together. Scholars still argue whether these feasts were weekly occurrences or reserved for rare, significant moments. Odd, quirky detail: some Viking feasts included roasted swans or even bear meat for those wealthy enough to hunt them. The unusual protein sources weren't merely sustenance, they were status symbols, displays of prowess and wealth. You imagine a table where the smell of roasting game mingles with sweet honey cakes and pungent fermented fish. You notice that ritual offerings were intertwined with meals. Bowls of honey and mead might be poured out in honor of Odin or Freyr before any eating began. The Vikings believed that sharing food with the gods ensured protection and favor. Even the smallest piece of bread could carry spiritual significance. Children run between the benches, snatching bits of skyr, berries, or honeyed treats. Meanwhile, the adults discuss the day's events, retelling tales of raids, storms, and heroic deeds. Food here isn't just nutrition. It's storytelling, memory, and identity rolled into a single experience. Quirky detail: Vikings sometimes played food games, rolling nuts across the table, seeing who could catch the largest piece of cheese mid-air, or daring each other to taste the strangest preserved meats first. You can almost hear the laughter, the teasing, and the clinking of horns in the warm, smoke-filled hall. You notice preserved roots, tubers, and pickled vegetables alongside roasted meats. Even seemingly humble dishes carry meaning. A bowl of fermented cabbage might be as vital as a roasted bird in ensuring survival and sharing wealth. Scholars still argue about the exact frequency of these grand feasts versus everyday meals. But evidence suggests that when they occurred, they were elaborate affairs that combined survival, indulgence, and ritual in a way that modern diners rarely experience. You take a slow breath, imagining the mixture of smells: smoke, honey, roasted meat, and fermented fish. The room feels alive, pulsating with the energy of community, the rhythm of eating, drinking, storytelling, and toasting the gods. You realize that Viking cuisine, however strange or daring, was never just about the food. It was about living fully, celebrating what life offered, and turning even the harshest survival into moments of connection and joy. You lean back, the firelight flickering gently across the walls of the longhouse, and a quiet calm settles over you. The chaos of strange foods, daring raids, and robust feasts fades into the warmth of memory. You can almost hear the distant waves lapping against the shore, the soft creak of the longship rocking in the fjord, and the faint rustle of wind through pine branches outside. Imagine the heart's glow casting long, dancing shadows across the faces of Vikings, young and old, laughing quietly now as the night deepens. The horns are empty, the mead drained, and even the oddest dishes have left only stories and lessons behind. You feel the texture of the hard bread and the tang of fermented fish, lingering not on your tongue, but in your mind, a gentle reminder of resilience, adaptability, and the human spirit. Outside, snow drifts silently across frozen landscapes, muffling the world and carrying a serene hush. Inside, warmth and life continue, but in a softer, gentler rhythm. The Vikings' fearless approach to food and survival becomes a meditation on embracing the unknown, savoring life's peculiarities, and finding joy in unexpected places. Your eyes grow heavy, and the distant sounds of a crackling fire become a lullaby. You remember the stories of mead, blood cakes, and roasted game not as shocking oddities, but as symbols of ingenuity, courage, and community. Every bite, every sip, every feast carried a deeper purpose: nourishment of the body, the mind, and the bonds between people. Now, let your mind wander further into that quiet longhouse, the night stretching around you like a velvet blanket. Feel the warmth, the stories, the laughter fading into whispers. Take a slow breath, relax, drift. End of script, sweet dreams.